This week's Parsha is Parashat VaYetze. Last week, we spoke about the personality of Yitzchak, and today I would like to speak about Jacob. And I'd like to begin, and this will actually be more in keeping since I'm no longer teaching in Pardes's regular program, so I'm going to try to do this in a way that I would do when I would be teaching in Pardes itself, not Parshat Shavua, but just teaching Chumash. Okay, I see some people here who are in my Chumash class, so it'll be memories of the old days. So the Parsha begins by saying, VaYetze Yaakov mi Beersheba, VaYelech Kharan. This is chapter 28, verse 10 in Bereshit. And Rashi is actually troubled by a problem in the text, which is, why tell me that Yaakov left Beersheba? We know that. So the answer that he gives is because this is teaching you that when a tzaddik leaves a place, so you feel their lack. But in fact, you could ask the question, why do we need this verse altogether? Because we already know from the end of last week's Parsha, and this is essentially in chapter 28, verse 5, that it says, Yitzchak sent Yaakov, he went to Padan Aram, to Lavan. So in effect, this verse is superfluous. So this is what's called a methodological point, that evidently the Torah repeats this. It's a way of saying we're beginning a new section. And in effect, what we're now doing is going to be telling you about the life of Yaakov. It's true, we already saw in the previous Parsha, right, two incidents that involved Yaakov. And as I mentioned last week, that's usually what people focus on in last week's Parsha. But in fact, our Parsha, and I would add next week's Parsha, but essentially our Parsha, is really giving me an insight into who Yaakov is and what is his contribution to the Jewish people. By the way, in last week's Parsha, I didn't mention this, but as long as I'm on a roll, so to speak, you could say the same thing when it started out by saying, Eile toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham. Avraham holidit Yitzchak. And we spoke about why do you have to emphasize that Yitzchak is the son of Avraham. But the simple explanation is what I mentioned last week, is because last week's Parsha is really telling me about Yitzchak, his life story. And again, what was his contribution to the Jewish people? So I think this is a literary device which is essentially signaling to you that we're about to focus in, as they would say today, zoom in on this particular personality. And that's what we're doing right now. So now let's look at that first pasuk. And Yaakov left Beersheba and he went to Kharan. So here's another methodological point. That in many places in the Torah, you describe a certain geographical movement. But in reality, what we really want to tell you is an existential movement. And in effect, what the Torah wants to tell you is, what does it mean for Yaakov to leave Beersheba to go to Kharan? And that's what I'd like to begin with. And in order to appreciate that, you have to understand what's the significance of Beersheba. Now, we spoke about this last week, and perhaps not enough at the very end, but let me just recap a little bit. Beersheba is actually a very, very significant place, both in the life of Avraham and in the life of Yitzchak. Beersheba initially gets its name during the time of Abraham, and you could look this up at the end of chapter 21, when Avimelech comes to Avram and says, I'd like to make a pact with you. And this is the first time that Abraham makes a pact with anyone. And on that basis, they now have a relationship, which is very, very significant. But why is it called Beersheba? Because it was actually a dispute about wells. And Avram gives Avimelech 7 sheep, and by Avimelech accepting them, he is acknowledging Avraham's ownership of these wells. And maybe I'll just refer you to the end of chapter 21. If you look at chapter 21, verse 32, it says that they Vayichretu vrit Beersheba, they made a pact, a covenant in Beersheba. And then Avimelech the king goes back to the land of the Philistines. And then look at verse 33 and 34. It says, Vayita Eshel Beersheba, and Avram plants a certain type of tree in Beersheba. Vayikra Sham b'Shem Hashem El Olam. He calls out the name of God. So that it's not just that Avram made a pact with the king, but Avraham now plants a tree, and it seems the significance of that tree is that this tree becomes perhaps a venue of hospitality that Avraham will be exercising. He calls out in the name of God. And then I want to look at the next verse, 34. Vayagor Avraham be'eretz plishtim yamim rabim. And Avraham dwells in the land of the Philistines for many days. Now, it's actually very interesting, the usage of the word. It's even kind of an oxymoron, because living somewhere for a long time would seem to be saying you're established there. But the word that's used is vayagor, which means he's dwelling as if temporarily. Which means that although Avraham is living there for a very, very long time, he is still not necessarily established there. But what I want to point out is Avraham made a pact. Avraham plants an Eshel. He calls out the name of God. He lives in the land of the Philistines for a very long time, which means to a certain extent, Beersheba symbolizes a certain what I would call anchor of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And that point becomes reinforced in last week's Parsha, which we spoke about, with Yitzchak. Because once again, another Avimelech, and this is chapter 26, comes to Yitzchak and says that he sees that God is with him. Okay, for those of you who would like to actually see this in the text, this is chapter 26, verse 28. Avimelech says, we have seen that God, Hashem, is with you. And now let us make a pact. And then they say in the end of verse 29, you are the blessed one of God. And this is what I mentioned last time, that Yitzchak actually comes to what we would call today normalization with his surroundings. He eats, he drinks, he sends away these people in peace. And what's even more significant is that in verse 32, the day after, okay, that his servants dig wells, okay, and it's not an issue. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because Beersheba to Yaakov symbolizes how the Jewish people have, quote unquote, made it in the land of Israel. They have now become accepted by the surroundings. They've made a pact. With Yitzchak, he took it to the point of it not just being a piece of paper, but of being actually normalization. Beersheba is the place, as I mentioned last week, where Yitzchak, perhaps makes the desert bloom, or it becomes a symbol of that. So that to a great extent, the journey which Avraham began in chapter 12, when God said to him, Lech Lecha, has now become in a way solidified in Beersheba. Beersheba is where the Jewish people, as I said, are beginning to really strike roots, to be at peace with their surroundings, to actually develop the land of Israel, and in a way, although again, I'm qualifying this, to be able to finally call it home. And now what's happening with Yaakov? Yaakov is now going from Beersheba to Kharan. Kharan is the place where God appeared to Abraham. This is chapter 12, and told him, Lech Lecha, leave that place. Leave your family to go to the place of your destiny. And here is Jacob, who is essentially now reversing that whole course. Here is Jacob now leaving a place which is not only home, but one might even say which is the place of his destiny. And I will now use this term to now go into exile. Last week, I mentioned to you that in many ways, Yitzchak becomes a symbol of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, of the Jewish people succeeding in the land of Israel, transforming the land of Israel into the land of God, so to speak, where God's presence is reflected through the land. And Jacob now becomes the first model, and maybe I would say the model, of the Jewish people going into exile, or what we would call the Galut Jew. By the way, think about this. It's actually very interesting because, every time I have to start preparing a shir, and I don't want to just rehash what I've said before. So I start thinking about various things, and one of the things that really struck me is that here is Jacob, who's going into exile, essentially because of the conflict with his brother. And I'm not going to get into this whole discussion right now. Was Jacob correct in masquerading as his brother and in fooling his father? Okay, I'll just tell you, bottom line, right? And I'm sure there are people here who will disagree with me, but my position is that to a certain extent, yes, he did the right thing on a certain level, but as Rav Lichtenstein once said in a drash of his, he may have done the right thing. He may have chosen what you call the lesser of two evils in terms of his options. But nevertheless, he paid a heavy price for it. And in this case, the price which he paid by fooling his father, by masquerading as his brother, was to, in effect, invoke the enmity of his brother, which ultimately is the reason why he is now going to Kharan. Yes, it's true, his father sent him there in order to be able to find a wife. And that's what we see at the end, of last week's Parashat. But in fact, the real reason is what came a few verses before that, when his mother says to him, your brother wants to kill you and you got to get out of here. You got to run away because I don't want to lose the two of you. And by the way, I think this actually follows a very interesting pattern throughout the Tanakh, that somehow exile always seems to be a natural consequence of sin. And that when people do something wrong, that somehow they lose a certain reality. They go into exile. So I'm taking a little bit of a long time talking about this, but I hope it's worth it. That Yaakov right now is going into exile. Yaakov right now, in effect, is losing a world which is not only comfortable, but is the world of his destiny. He should be in the land of Israel. He should now be following in the footsteps of his predecessors, building altars, digging wells, calling out in the name of God. And instead, Yaakov now is a fugitive. He's running away from his brother. And where is he going? He's going to Kharan. Some people might say it's like you're running away from the frying pan into the fire. Because when he now goes to Kharan, it will not be a picnic for him. And so what I would like to begin with, in terms of talking about Yaakov, is that if last week when I spoke about Yitzchak, it seems that Yitzchak's life in many ways, I don't know if I didn't say this last week, so I'll say it now. Yitzchak's life in many ways was magical. It's like everything always worked out, kind of. In the end, his wife, who was barren, has twins. In the end, there's a famine. He doesn't have to leave the land of Israel. He plants during the famine. He produces 100-fold. Okay, everybody, there are a lot of comments on the chat. I have to tell you, I can't relate to them right now. So save your comments for afterwards, and I'm happy to address it after the shiur. So Yitzchak, in Yitzchak's life, everything falls into place. By the way, I'll say something now, and I'm sure there'll be people who are going to write some comment, but that's okay, that even giving the blessing to Yaakov was actually the right thing to do. And Yitzchak, in the end, did give the blessing to the right person, even from his perspective. By the way, I'll just make the point for those of you who, want, how do I know that? So I'll just say, because first of all, you see that Yitzchak throughout is very suspicious. Who is this person who's before me? Is it Yaakov? Is it Esav? And there are many, many things that might indicate to him that it's not really Esav, it's Yaakov. In the end, the reason why he gives him the blessing, if you look this up, chapter 27, verse 27, it says, Jacob comes near to Yitzchak, he kisses him, he smells his clothing, and then he blesses him, and he says, behold, the smell of my son is like the smell of the field which God has blessed. Which means from Yitzchak's perspective, the one to carry on his legacy is the one who is able to have that smell of the field which God has blessed. Yitzchak was able to bring blessing to the field. Whoever can now perpetuate that, he deserves to get the blessing. So, Yitzchak's life, more or less, was really, I say to my kids, a bowl of cherries. It was like great. Everything was wonderful. But I'm exaggerating a little bit, because it's not that everything was wonderful. The thing that wasn't wonderful in Yitzchak's life, and you might even say the tragedy of Yitzchak's life is Esav. And even Yitzchak is conscious of that. When Esav, at the age of 40, marries Canaanite women, and it says, this is just at the very end of chapter 26, it says that they were bitter spirit to Yitzchak and Rivka. Okay, I'm going to hold that for a moment. Now, why did I make such a big deal about this? Because Yaakov's life is radically different. Yaakov's life is filled with crises, with pain, with a lot of struggle. And that's what we begin to see in our Parsha. The very fact that Yaakov has to leave Beersheba, is going to Kharan. He's not going to Kharan as a happy camper. He realizes he's going to Kharan to run away from his brother, who at any moment might kill him. He realizes that he's going to Kharan, which may very well be a hostile environment. And maybe I would also add to this. Yaakov is going to Kharan alone. Think about this. Yaakov is now reversing what Avraham began in Lech Lecha. But when Avraham did his Lech Lecha, he had what you could call a supportive group behind him. He went with his wife, he went with his nephew, he went with the souls that they had made in Kharan. Yaakov is now going to Kharan alone. And I assume there are probably quite a few people here who might identify that if you find yourself going to a new place, and from Yaakov's perspective, he never was in Kharan. So it's true, yes, he has some family there, but they may not necessarily be the nicest of people, as you go on to see. But it might be very frightening to have to go to a new place where you don't know anybody, especially when you're giving up a place, which is comfortable in every way. Now, in case you still don't believe me, so let's look at the next pasuk. After it says, VaYetze Yaakov mi Beersheba, so then what are we told? In the second pasuk of the Parsha, it says, this is again, chapter 28, verse 11, Vayifka b'makom vayalen sham kiva shemesh, vayikach me'avnei hamakom vayasem ra'ashotav, vayishka b'makom mahu. And Yaakov encounters the place, and he lies down there because the sun is set, and he takes from the rocks of the place, places it around his head, and he lies down there. Now, the word vayifka means to encounter. But we know in modern Hebrew, the word lifgoa means to hurt. Pigua is the word for a terror attack. And even though some people would say, well, but how could you talk about biblical Hebrew based on modern Hebrew? I think that a good case could be made even in biblical Hebrew for what I'm about to say. And that is that vayifka is not just to encounter, but it's an encounter which is painful, stressful. By the way, the rabbis based on this verse say that Yaakov instituted tfilat arvit, and they say the word vayifka is an expression for prayer. And they bring a verse from Jeremiah. Anybody who's interested, I have a podcast on this, Parashat Chayei Sarah, I think about 7 years ago. So in any case, and at that time I mentioned that if you assume Yaakov is praying here, the nature of Yaakov's prayer is the prayer which is coming from crisis. It's a prayer which is painful. It's a prayer where Yaakov is begging for God to protect him, to watch over him. A prayer where he's extremely afraid and needs some sort of comfort. And I'm saying all this because what I'm describing right now is not just a one-time phenomenon, but I think this is something which comes up again and again in the life of Yaakov. Yaakov lives a life where he feels he's going from crisis to crisis, where he feels that his whole world may completely fall apart, and where he needs to be able to have some sort of support. And the support that he has is essentially turning to God. And by the way, this is what we see in the next pasuk. When it says Yaakov has a dream, and this is the famous dream which everybody is familiar with about the ladder with the angels going up and down, and there are many, many different interpretations. I want to look at what God actually says in this dream. If you look at, again, chapter 28, verse 13, God says to Yaakov, I am Hashem, the God of Abraham your father, the God of Yitzchak. The land which you are sleeping on, I will give to you and your seed, and your seed will be like the dust of the earth, and they will burst forth, west, east, north, south, and all the families of the earth will be blessed in you and in your seed. And I'm going to come back to these two verses, but what I want to see is the next verse, 15. And behold, I will be with you. I will guard you wherever you go. I will return you to this land. I will not abandon you until I have done all that I've said to you. By the way, you shouldn't interpret this to mean that after I've done everything, I'm going to abandon you. But it means that I will not abandon you. I will be with you the whole time. By the way, you should just know the language of being abandoned is a language that we see later on in the book of Deuteronomy and Dvarim when the Jews go into exile. The feeling that the Jews are abandoned when they go into exile. And here is God who's saying to Yaakov, I'm with you. So I just want you to see God is appearing to him because evidently Yaakov is extremely anxious. And here is God who's saying to him, don't worry, no matter where you go, I will be with you. I will be with you, and I am, you could even say, guaranteeing to bring you back here, so that you can actualize your destiny, so that you can actualize, and now I want to go back to the first two psukim, what God promised Avraham. And now I want to say something which I think is pretty clear from this text. If you paid attention to what I was reading, there's a bit of a problem here. God says, I am the God, this is verse 13, I am the God of Avraham your father and the God of Yitzchak. So you go, wait a minute. His father is Yitzchak. So why is God saying, I am the God of Abraham, your father? Good question, no? And I think that the simple explanation is that, I mean, you could, one way to say it is that, that even grandparents are called parents, which we do find in the Tanakh. So it's a way of highlighting what you might call a close familial relationship. But what I would say is, on another level, in many ways, Abraham is Yaakov's spiritual father. To put it in different language, that it might be that Yaakov has more in common with Avraham than he has with Yitzchak. And it might and therefore, if you look, it's not only that God says, I am the God of Avraham, your father. If you look at what he promises him, right? He talks about north, south, east, west. He talks about all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. So I just refer you to the beginning of chapter 12, where God says to Avraham, I will make you a great nation, and through you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And I also refer you to chapter 13, after Lot leaves Avraham. This is chapter 13, verses 15 and 14, 15, 16, where God says to him, God says to Avraham, right? That knows, look north, east, west, south. And then he says, this land I'm giving to you. And not only that, but your seed will be like the dust of the earth. The expression like the dust of the earth is what he said. So what God did over here was to conflate two different statements that he made to Abraham and now say it to Yaakov. And for that reason, that's why he's saying, Avraham, your father, because he's connecting Yaakov much more to Avraham than to Yitzchak. And again, what I said earlier, what Yaakov is doing in many ways is a reversal of what Avraham did. Avraham had a lech lecha, leaving Kharan to come to the land of Israel. Lech lecha is leave your father's house in order to be able to now create your own home. So I'll say this now, and we're going to get to it hopefully at the end. Yaakov now is doing a reverse lech lecha. He's leaving his father's house. The house that's been established now in the land of Israel, 2 generations. And where is he going? He's going back to the previous reality. But in fact, by going back to that previous reality, he will be now founding his house. He will be now founding the Jewish people. And with that, he will eventually come back to the land of Israel. So that it's as if he's making a kind of circle, and what might even see as a kind of reversal, but in reality, it's a reversal which ultimately is going to bring him back to the same land, but bring him back where he's begun to actualize the, what I would call, core of the Jewish people. And I'm going to speak about this at the very end. So hold on, I haven't finished with that. By the way, I just want to say one thing in terms of the ladder. There are commentaries who see the ladder in the imagery of the angels going up and down as being a symbol of prayer, with the angels who are going up as symbolizing Jacob's prayers to God, and the angels who are coming down symbolizing God's response to his prayers. And then that would fit in very nicely with Vayifka b'makom, which is Jacob praying, and then God responding in kind. Okay, now I just want to say one more point, which also comes up here, which I think is also characteristic of Yaakov. And we will eventually speak about this in a future podcast about Joseph, and that is dreams. In our Parsha, right now, Yaakov has a dream and God appears to him. And then if you look later on in chapter 31 in our Parsha, when Yaakov is actually by Lavan, okay, he has another dream. For those of you who want to look, it's chapter 31, verse 10. He's describing a dream where he sees sheep in his dream. And in this dream, he's seeing, right, the proliferation of his sheep. And then the angel says to him in that dream, okay, I am the God who saw all that Lavan is doing to you. Okay, and then at that point, God says to him, go back to the land. So I just want you to see that in the parsha, there's a closure. In the first dream, which he has, God says to him, don't be anxious. I'll be with you throughout. In the second dream, God appears to him and says, okay, I am with you. And now I'm telling you, it's time to go back. Now, what I want to point out, though, is the fact that dreams are an important part of Yaakov's life. And it may very well be that for people who find themselves in very, very difficult situations, having dreams is what sustains you. Your ability to see beyond your reality, your ability to perhaps see a different reality, which is much nicer, much rosier. And if dreams play a significant role in Yaakov's life, they're even more significant in Joseph's life. And I'll say this right now, previews of coming attractions. Joseph is the extension of Yaakov. And Joseph's life is filled with crises. If Yaakov goes into exile, Joseph goes even into a deeper exile. But I won't say any more about Joseph now. And by the way, everybody's familiar with Shir Hamal B'Shuv Et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kicholmim. The Shir Hamalot that we sing about is what the Jewish people sang when they were in exile and are coming back now. They're singing it when they're coming back, but they're singing it that we were dreaming when we were in exile, right? We imagined, and now look, it's actually happened. So I'm just saying dreams are very, very important. I don't want to say that only people who are in exile dream, because that's not true. But it might very well be that dreams take on a very, very significant role, because without those dreams, it's very easy to succumb to the hardships that someone is facing. So let's now move on a little bit. After Yaakov has his dream, and Yaakov then wakes up. So Yaakov wakes up, and in verse 16, he says, Vayikatz, Yaakov wakes up from his slumber, and he says, behold, there is God in this place, and I didn't know it. And then he is in awe, and he says, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God and the gateway to heaven. Now, you should just know there is a difference of opinion among various commentaries. There are a number of commentaries who say that the place where Yaakov is actually having his dream is the Temple Mount, Har HaMoriah. It's the place where eventually the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, will be built. And when Yaakov says how awesome this place is, he's specifically referring to the place, right, where Abraham did the Akedah, where according to some commentaries, that's the field where Isaac was contemplating. And this is where Jacob has his dream. And he said, and I didn't realize the magnitude of this place. I want to suggest another possibility. That maybe this is not the Temple Mount. But maybe what Jacob is so overwhelmed by is the realization that this place, as an expression of any place, could be where you could have a divine revelation. That I don't necessarily have to limit God to any specific place, but that even when you least expect it, you might have an I thou encounter. And that's awesome. The realization that God could actually appear anywhere. And that awareness is extremely important for where he's about to go. Because the realization that I'm going to a place which a priori I would say, there is no God. God is absent. And to realize that, no, just as I didn't expect to find God over here, I will find God over there as well. And as I showed you, Jacob does find God, even in Kharan, and has a dream, and God speaks to him. And that, I think, in general, is a very, very powerful statement, that we shouldn't necessarily limit God to a particular place, but to realize that we could actually experience God anywhere. And that anywhere could theoretically be the gateway to heaven. Now, the other thing, which is also very important here, is the fact that Jacob speaks about this being a house of God. And now I want to get to what is it that makes Jacob perhaps so unique. And before I do that, though, I want to look at the next verse. Vayashkem Yaakov baboker, and Jacob gets up early in the morning. By the way, I spoke to you about the parallels between him and Avraham. Avraham is somebody who's always getting up early in the morning. So here's Jacob, who gets up early in the morning. And then what does he do? He takes the stone which he had placed by his head, and it says, Vayasem ota matseva. He makes it a matseva, a memorial, a commemoration. And then what he does is he pours oil on it. And then he calls the place Beit El. And then he takes a vow in the next verse and says, if God will be with me and guard me and give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and I'll come back in peace to my father's house, and he will be to me a God, then this stone, this is the last pasuk, 22, this stone which I have placed as a matzeva will become a house of God. Now I want you to know that the word matzeva is really a very interesting word, because if you actually go back to Abraham and you go back to Isaac, you'll see that matzeva would seem to be parallel to another word, which is mizbeach, an altar. And in fact, by Avraham, it always talks about mizbeach, altar. By Isaac, it talks about Mizbeach. Jacob is the only one where it speaks about a matzeva. And in fact, not only does it speak about it in the beginning of the parsha, if you look at the end of the parsha, which is fascinating, when Jacob is running away from Lavan and he catches up to him, and then they have this encounter, and Jacob essentially gives a whole accounting for what's happened the past 20 years. And then finally, Lavan agrees to let him go. So if you look, this is chapter 31, verse, let me just find the verse, 44. 31:44. Lavan says, let's make a pact. Remember, we spoke earlier about the pact which Abraham and Yitzhak made with two Philistine kings. So now Lavan is saying, I want to make a pact. And he says, and I want there to be a testimony between us. And then if you look at verse 45, and Jacob takes a stone and he raises it up, a matzeva. So once again, the word matzeva comes up. Interestingly, here the matzeva is meant to be a kind of testimony to the pact which Lavan and Jacob are making between each other. And by the way, you also might get the sense that what characterizes a matzeva is you take a stone and you make it vertical rather than horizontal. So which again makes it very, very visible. And in the beginning of the parsha, Jacob takes this matzeva, the stone, and makes it a matzeva to also be a kind of commemoration of this I-thou encounter that he had, of this promise which God had made to him, right? The pact that God, of the, what I would call reinstatement of the covenant. But now what I want to bring up is matzevot, if you look throughout the Tanakh, were actually terms that were used for altars of non-Jews to their pagan gods. They would very often make a matzeva. In fact, if you actually go around Israel, you'll actually find various slabs of stone which appear from thousands of years ago, which were seen as being involved in all kinds of cultic worship, but single stones, as I described, a stone that you essentially erected vertically. And what we have here is a very interesting development, which is going from a matzeva to a mizbeach to a Beit Elohim. And so here I want you to see, this is where Jacob is now going beyond his ancestors, his forebears. Abraham and Isaac, they make matzevot. Matzevot is a structure. It's taking a whole bunch of stones and then building them, putting them together, and creating what we call an altar. It's not just taking a single stone slab. So already there's much more of what you call a human involvement, rather than taking a natural stone, erecting it, and having that as some sort of monument to your God. We're now actually having much more of a human effort to put together a whole bunch of stones. But Jacob is now taking it to a whole other level, because he envisions this place being a Beit Elohim, of being a house, of not just having an altar, but having a house of worship. And so what I want to now come to is that Jacob begins his journey in a place called Beit El. And by the way, Beit El came up the first time with Avraham. If you go back to chapter 12, okay, chapter 12, verse, let me just find it, verse 8. After Avram was in Shechem and built an altar, it says he then, VaYetze misham, he moves from there, but it's like he's also kind of copying. And he goes east of Beit El, and he pitches his tent. Beit El on the west, Ai in the east. And he builds an altar, which means in the vicinity of Beit El, and it sounds like it's not exactly Beit El. Abraham builds an altar. Here is Yaakov, who, again, if we just go by the Pshat, once again, I said to you, there are commentaries who say this Beit El is actually the Temple Mount. But if you go by the simple reading, this Beit El is what today we would call the area Beit El, which is north of Jerusalem. So here's Jacob, not only to the east of Beit El, he's in Beit El. And here he is in Beit El already envisioning not just an altar, but a house of God. So he is now taking this one step further. And so now I would like to come to the conclusion. A major part of our Parsha is what I would call Yaakov's life project, Yaakov's contribution to the Jewish people. What makes Yaakov's contribution unique to the Jewish people? And that is building a house. Building a house not as a physical structure, but building a house as a dynasty. And when you read subsequently, right, in chapter 29, and then chapter 30, it's fascinating how once again, we have parallels to the life of Avraham. Avraham's wife was barren, Jacob's wife is barren. Avraham then takes a maid in order to be able to have children. In the case of Jacob, that is at a later stage. But nevertheless, what the two of them shared in common, different than Yitzchak, is they had multiple wives. Yitzchak, as I think I mentioned this, is the only one who had one wife. That was it. And the Torah goes to great lengths to describe, and I will use this term, the tension, the struggles. You might even say the struggle to have a child, but not even the struggle to have a child, the struggle between the two sisters, the sense of the competition for Jacob's love. Now, what I want to point out is the following. Avraham, I think I mentioned to you last week, was a trailblazer. Avraham is the one who's building altars. Avraham is the one who is now dealing with what we would call cosmic issues. He is the one who's laying the foundation, right, for the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Yitzhak is the one who solidifies it, and it finds its expression in the field. As I said, transforming the desert into a Garden of Eden. But the two places where Avraham and Yitzchak, if you want to say failed, or if you want to put it nicer, did not succeed, was in their families. In the case of Abraham, he has 2 wives, but in the end, he has to make a choice between the 2. He has 2 sons. He has to make a choice between the 2. In the end, Abraham has a broken family. 1 wife and her son are sent away. And yes, it's true, according to the Midrash, since I'm sure somebody here is going to say it, that according to the Midrash, Yishmael eventually did tshuva, and Yishmael eventually is actually at Abraham's funeral. And not only that, but even by the way that we present Yishmael and Yitzchak, it's Yitzchak and Yishmael who buried Abraham, which would show that Yishmael acknowledged, right, Isaac's primary role. That's all true. Except that Yishmael is not part of the Jewish people. He's not part of that covenantal relationship with, with God. Isaac has 2 sons. A priori, both of them are the children of the covenant. And as I mentioned earlier, the tragedy is that Esav somehow falls out. But he should have been the child of the covenant. But he fell out. And I'll speak about that maybe much more next week. And that's a result of a failure on the part of Yitzchak, and I would add, which we'll speak about next week, on the part of Jacob as well. But Jacob succeeded where his forefathers, where his father failed. In the end, he has 12 sons, a daughter. All of them remain the core of the Jewish people. No one falls out. He succeeds in building a home. He succeeds in building not just one tribe, but a conglomerate of tribes. He is the one who ultimately lays the foundation for the Jewish people as a people. And I would add that he did that to a great extent, not in the land of Israel. Okay, I'm sure everybody knows that all of Jacob's sons were born outside the land of Israel, with the exception of Benjamin. This is Jacob's unique contribution to the Jewish people. Jacob, who goes on his reverse Lech Lecha journey, who is all alone, who goes to a world which is hostile, where he's terrified, succeeds in creating the seeds, and not only the seeds, the very significant seeds of a whole nation, which he eventually brings back to the land of Israel. Jacob succeeds in making his journey afterwards, leaving the house of Lavan in order to build his own house. I want to show you, make 2 more points. There are 2 things that Jacob that are central topics in the parsha. One is, as I said, all of the struggles in producing this family, physically producing the family. But then you have the second thing, which is where Jacob is very involved in looking out for his own support system in terms of financial support, right? The whole story about the sheep. And I'm not going to go into the whole story, but I just want to look at one point that comes up in that story. If you look at chapter 30, wait a second. After Jacob, okay, maybe let's just look at this thing. After Joseph is born, this is chapter 30, verse 28. It says that when Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob comes to Lavan and says, "Send me, let me go to my place and to my land. Give me my wives, my children that I've worked for. And you know how hard I've worked." And Lavan essentially says, right, yes, I do know how hard you've worked, but I can't let go of you. It's like you're a gold mine for me. And he says, just tell me, what do you want? What will it take to keep you here? And then Jacob says to him, right, what the deal is. Okay, but I just want to point out one pasuk where Jacob says in verse 30, Jacob says to him, right before he tells him what the deal is, he says, you know how before I came you had very little, and now all of a sudden you've burst out, and God has blessed you as a result of me. And then he says at the end of verse 30, and now when will I be able to also do for my house? Which means that Jacob's interest in the whole story of the sheep and in eventually becoming very, very wealthy was not because Jacob was looking to be wealthy. Jacob saw his wealth as something that was essential in order to be able to establish his house, which means that the essence of our parsha is Jacob establishing a house, a dynasty. And what he did was to have multiple children. Without that, he couldn't get anywhere. And to also be able to have the financial means to sustain them. And when he achieves that, that's when God says to him, it's time for you to now leave. Go back to your house. By the way, the idea of the house comes up a number of times here, and I'll just say two last things. If you look at chapter 30, chapter 31:14. After God appears to Jacob and says, you should go back, Rachel and Leah say to Jacob, we have no longer a portion or an inheritance in the house of our father. And that's the issue in this whole section. Is Jacob going to create an independent house? Or is he going to become subsumed under the house of Lavan? And it's Rachel and Leah who say, no, our portion, our inheritance is not with our father, it's with you. So that when Jacob now goes back, Jacob is not actually going back to his father's house. Jacob is actually creating his own house. Yes, clearly he's the descendant of Abraham and Yitzchak. But in the end, the Jewish people are known as Beit Yaakov, Bnei Yisrael. Our identity is connected with the house of Jacob, and that is his contribution to the Jewish people. And I apologize for overrunning. The very last thing that I want to say, I mentioned earlier that when Jacob has his dream, he puts up a stone and he says, this stone will become a house of God. And it may very well be that the house of God is very much connected with the house of Jacob. If I said to you that last week, that what Isaac does when he transforms the desert into a Garden of Eden is to essentially bring the divine presence through nature to manifest itself in the world. What Jacob does is to now create a family who, in the language of the rabbis, will be the chariot of God, where God's presence will be reflected in their midst. And probably the most beautiful way of seeing this is in the beginning of the book of Numbers, when the Jewish camp is organized with the tabernacle in the center, the tabernacle which has the presence of God. But it isn't just that God is in the tabernacle. It's God is now in the camp of the Jewish people surrounding it. Jacob is the one who lays the foundations for that, because his family totally will be that vessel for God's presence being manifest in the world. Thank you, everyone. Shabbat Shalom.